Bonjour, Michael Sinatra, le directeur du Centre de recherche interuniversitaire sur les annuités numériques, qui est le plaisir de vous accueillir aujourd'hui pour notre deuxième séance de travail des membres du CRIHN. Nous recevrons aujourd'hui Jason Camlot de l'université Concordia et ses collègues pour parler du projet SpokenWeb. Jason.
Merci, Michael. Thank you, everyone. We're very happy to be here presenting on the SpokenWeb project at CRIHN. So I'm Jason Camlot. I'm a professor dans le département d'études anglaises at the University of Concordia. I'm also the director of the SpokenWeb Partnership Research Program. And I'm here with Wiercinski. Maybe you'll introduce yourself, Jared.
Yeah, sure. Je travaille comme bibliothécaire. En fait, c'est bibliothécaire, associate university librarian for research and graduate studies. I've been working with Jason and Tomasz for a while on the project, and yeah, it feels good to be here to present today. Thank you for having us.
You will see Tomasz Neugebauer.
Yeah, so I'm the digital projects and systems development librarian at Concordia University, and I'm working on this project.
Good. So we felt it would be useful to provide just an introduction to the SpokenWeb research program to begin with, and then we're going to move into the work of one of the task forces. There are many different task forces working on different elements of the project. Basically, the metadata work that we've done since the project began. And finally, we'll talk about some ongoing work, which includes the development of an ingest system, which I know Tomasz and Francisco, the system developer, presented a little bit at the open showcase recently. And then, really, we look forward to having a conversation afterwards about any elements of our project. So that's what I just said we were going to do. A little bit behind. And everything we're doing, so the SpokenWeb research program, as I said, is a SSHRC partnership grant-funded project, research program. I'm going to tell a little bit about sort of the development of the project from the beginning. And I should say that just as a core principle, as we've developed this over the last 7 years, students are really at the focus, at the center of our development and of all our projects. So in our application for the grant, we were committed to 67% of the total funding going to students. That's a very high number for a research program that has a lot of digital development connected with it, because often you need funds to put in other places. And we want to involve students from a wide range of programs in every facet of what we're doing. So the reason I'm mentioning this on this very first slide is because even logo design for the research project was developed by 2 design students at the University of British Columbia. And they went through a whole pitching process and basically provided us with iterations of possible logos for our project, etc. So every little element, whether it's organizational, systems development, literary research, whatever, we see as an opportunity for training students. This project begins with this, basically boxes of analog media artifacts that document literary events of different kinds. And the project really began a decade ago with a box like this and then a few others of a single collection of sound recordings that documented a reading series that took place in Montreal in the 1960s and 70s. It's about 100 hours of audio of a very coherent series of North American poets from Canada and the United States. And I'm going to give you a little bit of a sketch of sort of how this project scaled up into what it has become. And along the way, I'll sort of explain what the beast of a partnership grant is, because it's a unique kind of grant. It doesn't really belong to the researchers in the same way that other grants do. It belongs to the partners, the institutions and communities that are involved. And the researchers are just sort of the agents making the work happen for those entities. But if the project really began with this box of tapes, if you look at this, sorry, it's really small, but it began with a small little internal grant, right, to essentially have those tapes digitized, right, and to begin to work on developing a catalog. I had no idea what was on those tapes other than someone said there was a reading series that might be interesting. And it occurred to me very early on that This was a useless collection of materials that had been deposited in our university archives. Useless because no one was going to listen to them, no one could navigate them, no one could use them in any way for research or teaching or anything. So the goal in that first instance was, how do we make these, if there's something interesting in them, how do we make them useful for research, teaching, other possible uses? So essentially, with this small initial internal grant, I hired some graduate students, and we listened to, digitized, and transcribed and timestamped all of the content of the tapes. So we did this manually, right? We didn't really have a system or structure for doing it, but we used software that was designed specifically for transcription. I consulted with oral historians who use those kinds of transcription softwares a lot. And it allows you to slow down the audio without the pitch changing, so you can listen to it and time it to your typing speed. And we didn't really know what we were doing. We thought in the first instance we were creating a print catalog, you know, if you can imagine, so that people who wanted to listen could just like find, you know, oh, at 3 minutes and 33 seconds we can hear this or that. So we created a text document with timestamps. That was it. We identified every poem that was read, and then all of the extra poetic speech, so not the read poems, because we didn't have the rights to the text of the poems, but the things that were said in the readings, we transcribed. And I'll show you what that looks like a little bit later. And we had, you know, several 100-page document, essentially, that documented all of these recordings. And then it occurred to me, after talking to a few designers and developers, that the text file we produced is data, right? That could actually be used to develop an interesting kind of digital display of the audio. So pretty quickly, within a few years, I was also doing research on early spoken sound recordings. So I'm kind of a historian of the medium of sound recording from the very early acoustic era, 1870s, 80s. And I was working on a book project and on sort of methods or modes of recitation, the way literature was read out loud from the 19th century to the 20th century. So the long history of recitation. And so I started applying for, and I think Michael even mentioned some of these grants to me early on. You know, you should apply for an image text sound grant. You know, think about the relationship between sound and visualizations of sound, because he knew I was working with sound. So I started applying for these smaller short grants that were very much focused on some technical questions. For Recite, which was this, you know, digital tools for analysis of the and interactive use of literary spoken recordings. It was about software tools that could be used to analyze prosody. In other words, like the way a poet reads the poem, right? Whether they go up or down, you know, and you could visualize the prosodic movements, right? And there are some software that linguists use. You may be familiar with one called Pratt. It's a very clunky, not user-friendly software tool that, because it's used by linguists, works on very short segments of sound, but is very interesting and rich in terms of being able to visualize prosodic features of audio. So we spent a few years working on developing methods of doing that. And then a second one, an RDI grant, was about thinking of developing the web interface. So that's where we took that original text file that we had created, sort of unwittingly, and converted it into data for presenting. And you should time me because I'm only on the first slide here, right? In any case, as each of these projects expanded, I began drawing upon the expertise of people outside of my field. So, and initially internally at Concordia, from computation arts and design, librarians, you know, who were on the RDI project in particular. I was interested in, I was beginning to think, well, we have this collection here, what other collections like this exist, right, in Canada? So we actually conducted a survey of over 700 archives and libraries and community, you know, people who had organized series, and we learned that there were an enormous number of these collections. Many of them never deposited in archives, actually. Many of them not digitized, sitting in shoeboxes, you know, in cupboards or basements and things like that. And so that's when we felt, well, there's a lot of interesting cultural heritage material out there that is interesting for a few reasons. One, because when you pursue literary history, not based on text alone, but actually think about literary history through sound documents, right? it introduces a whole new sort of set of questions about what methodologies do you use, and also allows you to hear or gives you access to information that you don't have from the printed page alone. Audio captures, insofar as you're listening to events of literary performance, it captures a kind of sociality, a sense of communities in action around literature, right? That you can actually hear that you don't necessarily get just from the printed page. And it also sort of early on in these projects made me realize that in order for us to understand really what the audio documents meant to those who participated, to the readers and to the audience members, we needed to engage in oral history as another methodology. So we sort of launched an oral history project to help us contextualize the significance of the audio collections that we were listening to. Because the recordings don't always explain themselves, right? You can hear someone reading a poem or reading for an hour, but you may not know who that person is because they don't say their name at the beginning, right? You don't even know whose voice it is you're listening to, let alone what the significance of that person reading that poem at that time, is. So there's a lot of very basic information sometimes that you don't have. And that's why metadata for these projects is so very important, because increasingly, as these kinds of materials get digitized, they're sort of floating as these fugitive artifacts, right, on the internet, often without any sense of grounding data that allows us to understand what it is we're actually listening to. So a very important principle, I mentioned the students as one important principle of our program. And a second one is sort of grounding historically as much as possible the artifacts that we're engaging with. So metadata becomes a kind of core question and tool, almost an ethic, of a project. In any case, as the project grew, we added all kinds of sort of experts in the computational analysis of sound. So we have experts who work with digital audio for information. We have a large team of librarians and literary researchers. We have sound artists, etc. I'll sort of show you the team. So these are the partners right now. We're working with collections held by these universities: Simon Fraser, UBC, University of Alberta, University of Calgary, University of Toronto, University of Victoria at the University of Toronto, Concordia. And we have sort of relevant expertise in the computational analysis side and other areas at these other American institutions and some Canadian ones. We have some community partners that we're starting with. But as word of this project has gotten out, we have people emailing us now like, I have a box of tapes, So there are kind of all kinds of collections that are suddenly being brought to us. And we're working on developing a process by which we can actually begin to catalog all of these collections and do different kinds of research around them. Anyways, as you can see, we have a team now of about 50 researchers in different disciplines. And to start with, we have about 25 students across all of our institutions. At Concordia alone, this is sort of what the team looks like. So this is just in year one. We're not even finished our first year of the project. So it's really just taking off right now. For a group like this and for projects like this, you need a governance structure. I'm not going to go into detail about it, but I'm happy to talk about it after. But we have a pretty effective, I'd say, governance structure for how everything's working. And I guess the main point, two main things I'll mention before we move on to the more specifics, is some of the core aims of the project, some of the core methods we're using, and then I'll sort of show you some of the task forces that we've created to achieve those aims and pursue the methods that we're using. So what are the key aims of the SpokenWeb research program? As I said, in the first instance, it's to inventory and index existing collections in Canada, but also to discover them, because there are many hidden collections held by institutions and community partners. And really, in the first instance, to establish a kind of understanding of the holdings that we have in our country. And to digitally preserve them. Library of Congress has identified reel-to-reel tape as a kind of in peril, endangered media species, right? It's given a lot of tapes that were made in the 60s about 10 years to live, essentially. So digital preservation becomes an imperative if we want collections that a lot of universities have been really acquired and put money into preserving over the years, soon they'll be useless, right, if we don't actually move to digitization. And once we digitally preserve them, it's also ultimately to aggregate our collections, to think of our collections in relation to each other, right? Because I showed you a box of one collection that we have at Concordia University. It was made when it was Sir George Williams University. But what does that collection mean in the larger context of literary activity in the country? If we start thinking of our collections in relation to each other, we begin to see a lot of interesting things. The migratory patterns of poets across the country as they were giving readings, right? Who was invited, where and when and why, what kind of influences from, say, the States were taking place in Quebec literature, in Canadian literature. What poets or movements or scenes are not representative in our institutional archives, right? And why, right? Were there communities that resisted depositing in official university archives? Were there ones that weren't valued enough to be accepted, right? So that's where the acquisition and thinking about including community collections becomes very important, because it also puts into some relief the history of institutional archive building in the country around these kinds of materials, and maybe to begin to question some of the decisions that were made over time. This is obviously a very important question to be asking now about, we have several indigenous collections now that are sort of entering our project. What is the place of those collections in relation to the other national or institution of higher education collections? We have other collections, even within Quebec. There are projects at UQAM that have been working on Quebecois literature in this format, but we found a lot of other festivals, like Haitian community literary series and things like that, that just were out of the purview, right, of some of those collections. And so those are collections that we're very interested in. We're really interested in thinking about interdisciplinary approaches to doing literary history with this kind of material. And as I said, we're also interested in developing computational methods for the analysis of literary sound. So we have a whole task force that's working on basically different tools for analyzing the signal itself and thinking about the implications of what that will yield for what we might be able to say about these kinds of audio texts, as we call them. And finally, we're really interested in creating online modules, interactive exhibitions, platforms for the display of these materials so that they can be used in research and teaching. And also, and last night we had one example, we're doing all kinds of interesting public events to go with the digital work that we're doing, in a sense, making these archives speak in new public contexts. So, in a sense, mashing up, remixing, taking the archival audio and making new sound works out of them, integrating them with new kinds of readings. And we've done events where we bring in poets who read, say, in the 60s and 70s, and we hold archival readings, essentially, where they read live, but also their reading from 1967 is performed alongside them as well. So different kinds of sort of archival performances. The methods, well, basically, we're interested in literary history, so the history of literary performance and practice as discernible in this media. But also, I think one of the things that this kind of artifact, one of the questions it poses to literary studies or challenges, is that it shows how sometimes most of the most interesting questions to ask of a sound recording aren't based on the content purely, right? It's not about close reading, right, the way we're sort of trained to do in literary studies, but it's about all of the different kinds of contextual infrastructure that allowed for the event to happen itself, whether it's institutional contexts, community or political contexts, and also media infrastructural contexts. What allowed these recordings to be made, themselves. We're interested in the cultural effects of the circulation of analog media. So how was tape used by writers, in the 60s and 70s? And we're finding from these collections that tape was used in a whole range of ways, not just to record things that were happening, but to compose, right? To create, mixtapes and works of sound art that would then be sent across the country and circulated and then be added to by others. So that tape became a creative medium in addition to be just a documentary medium. And our archives are revealing that to us, which poses all kinds of interesting problems for generically categorizing these tapes, right? Because it's not just a poetry reading, right? It's a dictation tape, or it's some kind of mixtape that we don't even know what it is. I'll give you one example. The Japanese-Canadian artist and poet Rui Kyuka was a tapeophile. He in the SFU archives, there are hundreds and hundreds of hours of audio that he recorded. He would go to the Cecil Hotel in Vancouver, which was like a meeting place of writers and artists, and he'd bring his tape machine, and he'd let it run. It would be a half-hour-long reel-to-reel tape, and he would just let it run and record the conversation, and then he'd rewind it, and he'd record over it again, and then he'd rewind it, and he'd record over it again. And by the end of the night, he was doing it partly as a kind of performance of the fact that time and our lives are ephemeral, right? And nothing can capture the complexity of everything. But also at the end of the night, he created a tape that had all this bleed through from multiple conversations, right? So he was doing a kind of temporal palimpsest, a kind of sound work, right? You know, from that. So there are all kinds of weird things that tape was being used for by writers. And then he would send that to a writer in Montreal or somewhere else. Like, listen to this, you know, it's a new poem I wrote, you know, you call it. You know? So they're interesting artistic artifacts. We're interested in sort of how they were circulated and why. And the same goes for digitized literary recordings. What does the circulation of these artifacts in digital environments mean, and what may they mean for literary practice and study going forward? And then, you know, also we're interested in sort of the impact that this can have on disciplinary practices and research, because as I said, we're bringing together methods from computational audio, oral history, GUI design, you know, all of those things, as well as sort of just literary history or close listening and close reading of text, right? So all of those together really raise new questions about what literary research is. And I guess I'd say most prominent among all of that is also thinking about digital libraries and archives, what archives are and how they actually impact what a discipline is. So that you could think literary studies is based on print-based archives primarily up to now. If we start focusing on sound archives, what happens to literary studies? Right? And you know, how can we develop those archives into databases that make them actually usable? Okay. Last thing I'll say. Oops, I'm going the wrong way here. Is our activities. So our research is pursued through projects via collaborative task forces. So task forces can consist of anywhere between 2 people and like 15 people, right? We have experts, and they include students and researchers. And these are some of the task forces that have been struck in our first year. They've not all been doing an enormous amount of work yet. Every task force has to produce a document that outlines its membership, what its purpose is, what its short-term, mid-term, and long-term goals are, right? And then that document will be updated over time because sometimes, you know, things change, right? We got our funding in the late spring, early summer, and we immediately struck a metadata task force because it occurred to me that the first thing we had to do was figure out how we were going to describe the artifacts that were at the core of our study, right? And so the metadata task force it's one of the larger task forces, and it consists of librarians. We'll talk more about it, so I'm going to put it aside. And I've just mentioned the systems task force is really thinking about what online systems we'll be using for ingesting the metadata, for example, and then also ultimately for hosting and delivering, right, the actual digital audio files, right, for different uses online. Analog digitization task force is focusing actually on the processes of digitizing legacy audio materials, because we have reel-to-reel tape, we have audio cassette, but then we have a whole range of other media. Sometimes a medium lasted 3 or 4 years. There were a lot of readings that were recorded on mini disc. I don't know if you remember what that medium looked like, right? You know, it was popular for like 3 years, right? The processes, one point of this is I'd like students to learn that there were media before MP3s, right? You know, and also to learn how those different media actually work. Because if they can understand that, then they can understand, how the artists who were making these recordings used them at the time, right? So we have spaces where students can engage with this analog media, but also to think about digitization not as this sort of transparent process, right? When you're digitizing something, you're actually reproducing it, right, in another medium altogether. And to really stress the fact that when you're migrating something from an analog source to a digital source, you're creating a new thing, right? And not just to think of it as this invisible thing that happens and suddenly have the same thing there. So that's what the Analog Digitization Task Force is about. The Audio Signal Analysis Task Force, as I said, is a series. We have a team of about 5 experts who specialize really in doing computational analysis of sound signals for different purposes. Some of them have developed pretty substantial tools for tracking prosody over like large corpuses of audio, for doing different kinds of sound searching. And then also another team is working on developing Python notebooks for sort of smaller sound analysis projects that will be much more accessible and potentially very useful for working with audio in the classroom and doing cool projects that way. Oral History Task Force is working on doing oral histories around all of our collections. We have a podcasting task force. Because our primary artifact is sound, right? It lends itself very well to the digital publishing medium of podcasting. And so we have an expert at SFU. She works in the digital publishing program there, and her whole area of research is podcasting. And so she's developed a podcasting program essentially for our project. So we plan on producing between 15 and 20 podcasts a year starting next year based on the audio of the archives. But there's a whole process. You have to pitch a podcast. You have to have it approved by the task force. And we'd like students across all of the institutions to be producing these things as one form of publication that will come out of our project. There's a pedagogy task force that's focused specifically on ways of teaching with sound. Research creation task force that's focused on creating works of art out of the archival materials. And archival events, sort of, I was already describing to you, but thinking of interesting ways to make these materials public. A community collections task force that is focusing on processes by which we can reach out to communities and bring those collections not only into our research project, but also, because we're multiple partners, into the appropriate library and archive so that they can actually be deposited and preserved for the long term, right, at one of our institutions. So I started that at Concordia, established an agreement with Concordia Library and Archives so that any community collection that I acquire will be accepted now by our library, will be preserved, for the long term. And if we get them evaluated, they can even get a tax receipt. So it's an enticement to some of the community members to want to contribute. Although they have to be evaluated, and evaluators are expensive. They charge like $200 an hour. So the tax receipt has to be valued enough to actually warrant, having it evaluated. I guess the rights management task force is very important because we have all of these materials, but what are the rights situations of these materials? So we have experts. We have a smallish task force of 4 people, but they're basically sketching out the landscape of rights around these materials and also developing strategies for advocating with our partner institutions and others, which tend to be conservative around rights, to try to pry open a little bit. The willingness to take risks, have takedown messages rather than just say no, things like that. And research data management is an important part for a project this large, obviously. So I guess we're gonna move on to the next section, and this is Tomasz.
I think it's Jared.
Oh, Jared, okay.
Yeah, so I'll talk a little bit about our methodology for developing our metadata scheme, basically getting into how we did it. I think that the main thing is we're working with these sound recording collections at a variety of institutions. Like Jason mentioned, they're in all kinds of different locations. Some might be in shoeboxes, others are in the darkest corner of your archive. There may be a particularly stern guardian of the archive that may or may not, make it easy for you to get access to. So I think it's really quite a Herculean task that we've undertaken. We're estimating the number of sound recordings at about 10,000 or so. And so the main point of this metadata scheme is for our student catalogers to use it to consistently and kind of systematically capture all of the information, the important information that is on or around these actual items themselves. You know, right from the start, we've kind of stated that our goal, at least initially, was to put an emphasis on facilitating access eventually to these collections, even just intellectually, but also like Jason mentioned, in a kind of web-based way before too long. But also, of course, to help students and faculty and the general public engage with these collections in a research context. Given that kind of orientation, we've decided to foreground descriptive metadata for the most part. So simple things like the title, seemingly simple things like the title, the title, the description, the indications, the statement of responsibility, who created the content, what genre is the content in, things like that. And a lesser emphasis on some of the technical information. We've also made a decision collectively that any kind of preservation activities, whether it's for analog preservation of things like reel-to-reel tapes or audio cassette tapes, or more frequently digital preservation, that's going to be the responsibility of the individual partner institutions. So our metadata scheme isn't really meant to capture that information, that metadata information, in any comprehensive way. So yes, like we said, our graduates, our student catalogers, who are typically graduate students within literature departments across the country, are going to use this metadata scheme as they interact, in a very one-on-one type close context, and catalog these items, and then they'll record the information that's required in the metadata scheme in an ingest system, which is a kind of web-based database system that Tomasz and Francisco have developed and presented, I think, at an earlier event. And so Tomasz will go into some detail again about that, if it's helpful, a little bit later on. It's also kind of interesting for us, anyways, to think back to how we got to this point in prioritizing metadata and just the history of this metadata task force. And it actually kind of goes back to an event, a SpokenWeb event called the Literary Audio Symposium, which was held in December 2016. A number of partners present and presenting, and through informal and formal discussions, we kind of really quickly realized that, not surprisingly, we were all cataloging these things in very different ways and with different metadata schemes. It would have been nothing short of a miracle if we had been already using the same metadata scheme. But as such, we very quickly realized that if we were going to move ahead with something like a partnership project, we would have to make sure we were using a unified metadata scheme. And then it's a slide or two here. A little bit behind. Okay, so I'll talk a little bit about the principles that are kind of driving our process. We've decided to go with a build our own kind of model, as opposed to choosing an established system. And there are many out there. I mean, part of it, I think, was that there wasn't anything that was quite exactly what we needed, and I'm sure that's a kind of a common experience. But I think more importantly, it ties to the fact that we weren't quite ready to choose our access system. So if you ever worked in this area, you know that metadata and access systems are very closely aligned. The particular access system that you use, it typically doesn't have that much flexibility with metadata, and it sort of sets more or less the requirements with some flexibility for the metadata that's required when you ingest the content to make it more accessible. So, I mean, it's a big decision on a project like this with the number of partners, the number of items, etc. I mean, we wanted to kind of, I think, partly buy ourselves a bit more time to carefully consider which system that we were going to use, and so devising our own metadata scheme, A, allowed us to create something that was kind of custom made for us, but B, buy us a bit more time as we look at some other options. So the options that are kind of, I guess, front runners for us right now, if you're interested, are systems like the Canadian-made Islandora system, and then there's an American system called Avalon. They basically roughly do similar things. And I should mention that we did develop our homegrown metadata system very much with an eye towards both these systems. So they're not that different. And should we choose one of those systems or something similar, the work in kind of creating a crosswalk from our metadata scheme into one of these metadata schemes that's kind of inherent in the Access system won't be that hard to do. I guess the next principle in terms of our process is using a kind of well-known agile method, which is to kind of do things quickly. So with our metadata scheme and also with our ingest system, to kind of work in sort of short spurts, get that get the first version of the metadata scheme out to the student catalogers who are actually using it, kind of on the ground, so to speak, to work with these collections. Get them using it, get their feedback quickly, and then make make changes quickly and in small increments, and kind of build up that way. So it's an agile approach. It's also necessarily iterative, right? So we didn't plan on perfecting this thing right from the start and then kind of chipping it in stone and then proceeding forth. It's something that's going to evolve, and that's built right into the whole workflow, and that's still being kind of developed. But again, it's important to emphasize that the metadata scheme and the ingest system are very much paired together. So any change in one needs to be echoed in the other. A different or another principle that we've followed is to take a distributed kind of model or approach in the sense that this metadata scheme is not something that we've built in a centralized top-down way. We've really tried to work with all of the partners as much as possible. So I think all of the partner institutions, or most of them, have representatives on our metadata task force. And for maybe the few exceptions that don't, there are many opportunities for them to provide input. That was, I think, a sort of philosophical and kind of, an important principle that we wanted to follow in building this metadata scheme. And this is interesting. I think something that we've done here is we've worked with what we're calling perhaps a sort of a simplified standards approach. So in building our metadata scheme, of course, we didn't just start from scratch and ignore all of the incredible amount of work that's been done in developing metadata standards. So we took a really close look at IASA, which is, if you don't know, the International Association of Sound and Audiovisual Archives, more directly in the kind of straightforward library world, the Anglo-American cataloging rules, things like mods, the Library of Congress subject headings, and everything like in those areas. The main goal with that, of course, is we wanted to work as much as possible with existing standards, for the purpose of interoperability. We don't want our system to be an island. We want it to be able to link out to other systems that discuss literature, poetry, oral history, these kind of interesting ways of studying sound and audio artifacts, etc. But what we did is we simplified them and made them more usable by student catalogers. So I'll give you a little example of what the IASA kind of procedures are for cataloging something like title. So I've shown one page here. In actuality, it's freely available on the web. If you go to the cataloging rules for IASA and look up how to catalog title, it's about 10 pages long. So that's pretty substantial work for just to get through the title of a single item. If you look at it a little closer, I know it's hard to see, but you can take my word for it. It's quite detailed. There are a lot of references in there, definitions, and parts of it that actually require quite difficult work. So it's a very common occurrence to come across an item when you're cataloging that doesn't have a title, or the title's ambiguous. And a very common solution to that is in library cataloging world is to create something called a uniform title. And it takes significant training to know how to do that and to do it properly and consistently. So I guess what I wanted to say is that if we had used these IASA rules or Anglo-American cataloging rules in their native format, A, we would have needed to work with professional librarians with considerable experience, and B, unfortunately, I don't think we would ever come close to completing the cataloging in the time frame allotted to this project, which is 7 years. To go through a cataloging everything at these elevated standards would be great because of all of the robust structure that's inherent in them. But the reality is, in the real world, if we want to get things done, and it's obviously not just cataloging, that's going to take up to 7 years, we need a different approach. So working with students was what we decided, and you know, I'll just move on to the next slide, and I'll just show you basically what we did. So we took essential elements of the IASA rules and the AACR2 rules. We expressed them in here in simpler ways. Tried to retain as much of the content that would promote interoperability as we could, and kind of intellectual robustness that's been built into these sort of inspirational metadata schemes, but greatly simplified. So whereas the IASA rules for title are about 10 pages, I cut it off a little bit here, but it's roughly 1 page or so. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit more. We've been kind of teasing you with little snapshots of different parts of the metadata scheme, and I think we're ready to show it to you in more detail. What we can do here is just kind of give you a very brief overview, and maybe I'll mention the people that have been particularly you know, involved in creating this version of the metadata scheme. So yeah, pretty much impossible to see, even for me, who knows these people. But so I'll just read them out. So of course, Jason Camlot, Rebecca Dosen from Simon Fraser University, Ian Ferrier, who's leads the Wired on Words project here in Montreal, Deanna Fong from Simon Fraser University, although she's, I think, currently based in Montreal. Roma Cal is based in, she's working at the University of Victoria, but it's within the University of Toronto. Keeps things interesting. Sean Loke is at the University of Alberta. Maurizio Meza, Tomasz, Neugebauer, and myself are all at Concordia. So these are the people that have contributed to this first version of the metadata scheme. Yeah, I'll just kind of advance the little video that Jason made, and you can kind of start to get a feel for you know, how involved it is, and the you know, the procedures that we've put in place for cataloging our collections. So
I'll just say one thing. This is the processing document that we gave to students, right? So actually, some of these fields are still 10 pages long in the original you know, work that the task force, which was divided up into teams of usually 2 people to work on a single field. So this is a kind of already shortened or dumbed down. Actually, no, we just tried to make it as clear as possible to use for our students. So this document is kind of an extraction of some of the fields that we actually created. And it's the goal of this document is really to explain to the students how to fill in each of the fields.
great. So yeah, now I think Tomasz is going to kind of take us through in a bit more detail about the metadata scheme, and then also talk to us about the ingest system, Swallow.
Yeah. So yeah, the thanks a lot. That was a really great summary of how we got here. Okay. So the metadata task force had the job of sort of collecting all of these information from the different partners, the different field names. And so one of the first things we did was just to have a brainstorming session together where we sort of listed what fields we thought were important. And then we tried to group them into sort of 3 categories. The first category is the sort of core required fields. And so this would be the minimal set without which you couldn't really participate in the project. So it was really required. So on this slide, you see kind of the results of that first meeting. So since the project is for making audio available online, terms of use were put in this category. And so in order to put it on, you really have to signal to people how they can use it, what's the copyright situation. Having an item title is required in most access systems. So title made it into this list. Contributors, a list of creators, like a statement of responsibility, is traditionally a primary access point. So that made it into this group as well. Because it's a multi-partner, multi-institutional project, the name of the collection that it's a part of also made it into this list. One field which was surprising to me that made it into this list was the location, and which, because as a librarian, I don't often see that listed as a core required field. But I guess it's the reason is because it was considered highly important in terms of the research objectives of the project. And so then the other category is the recommended fields. They're just as important as the core fields. So that they're highly recommended because for two reasons, and Jared alluded to this. One is that current metadata standards exist to support them, and also they have system support in existing access systems. And so things like language, material description, the roles of each contributor that they played, so were they a speaker, were they a recordist, that kind of thing. Various subjects, topical, geographic, genre, the timestamping, which we're going to get into some more detail. And then there are, the third category is kind of the additional optional fields. And not to say they're less important, it's just that they're not very well supported by current standards or systems. Interestingly, we initially placed the name of the cataloger in this category, but it actually made it into a recommended list, in part because of logistical reasons, is because we do need to keep track of who contributed what data. But yeah, in this category, these are fields that are really research-oriented fields that require either close listening or signal analysis, things like applause, laughter, frequency of the voice, the questions asked, the gender, nationality of the speaker. And at this time, actually, none of these fields actually in the current version of our schema. So we don't have detailed instructions on how to catalog any of these. And so this is kind of my attempt to sort of to summarize what the 60 or so pieces of information that is possible to collect for each item. We have, as I mentioned, the name of the cataloger, the title, the rights, the date. Most of these fields are from the recommended categories. So the material description, things like track configuration, playback mode, the tape brand. And it's expected that there will be considerable variety in terms of how much detail each individual item will have will include in its item metadata. So there is a lot of detail to specify for the creators. So we have built into this the schema the ability the recommendation to include a link to the authority record if it's a known if such an authority record exists for the poet or the contributor, and we adopted a convention to add custom descriptions or specify additional information about each of the fields that requires it in an additional notes field. And so, for example, if the title was generated by the cataloger rather than transcribed from the artifact, so it was a descriptive title, the title source note would provide additional information about what sources were used, how it was constructed. Similarly for locations, dates, rights, physical description. So if there was a standardized way to fill those fields out with the option of adding additional notes. So the location field includes an address, the name of the venue where the reading took place or the event took place, the latitude, longitude, and again, the URI of the OpenStreetMap location. So that, to enable in the future the ability to offer visualization tools. So there are also a series of fields to describe the digital artifact, including things like sample rate, file name, path duration, the encoding information, the name of the codec, and so on. These fields would normally be automatically extracted by the digital preservation system. such as Archivematica. But since they're also of interest from the research perspective, and they already are cataloged in some of these collections, the scheme has a place for them already in the current version. So one field that is a subject of ongoing work and discussion is the contents field. So in the first version of the scheme, we have just a simple text structure for timestamps at the beginning and end of a section, the duration and the title of the work that takes place within that time window, which is how it was done in an earlier iteration of the original SpokenWeb project. I think the software Transcriber was used for that. And however, I mean, there isn't really one standardized way of dealing with this. And so Avalon uses, was the very popular, one of the big access systems for audio and video. Avalon uses an XML format, and this is kind of a screenshot of what that looks like. And I actually recommended that we switch from the simple text format to this XML format in our scheme. And for two reasons. One is, it's compatible with Avalon, and so we already know some of our partners are using that system. And so that we would increase interoperability. And the other reason is that it allows for hierarchies. So you can, in addition to having just a series of titles, you can have a structure with sections and subsections. So for example, if you have multiple events, multiple readings happening on the same tape, you could structure your timestamps in a hierarchical way. And actually, I think this is probably a good moment to pass to Jason and maybe show how it was done in the past with Transcriba and some sample content.
Sure. Yeah. So what Tomasz just showed you is still we're still trying to figure out really, because that would be very labor intensive for, say, a grad student to to sort of mark up the timestamps in that XML script. So we're thinking we're going to need to move from a kind of text-based generating tool to something that will convert it into that XML script. We don't have that yet, but that's where we're at right in our thinking. But essentially, remember I told you where the project started, which was basically just listening and timestamping and creating a catalog. What we did, we used this tool. There are many tools like this. This is a just very user-friendly one, which allows you to type in a speaker name or a title name very easily. If you want to transcribe, text or speech, you can. And then every time you press return, essentially, it just automatically generates a timestamp. Right? So it just creates these timestamps very easily. And then you can export it, like I said, as a text file, and then convert it into something that you can use for online display. So I guess our project right now to think about is how to get it from that text output into XML, right? Which will then, I think, allow us to do a lot of interesting things for online display afterwards because of it already being in that format. This is what but even without it being an XML to begin with in this sort of standardized way, when we developed the second iteration of the SpokenWeb site, which was just for this one collection, it allowed us to do some pretty interesting things for navigation of the audio in relation to the transcript. So what you're going to see here is I'll play, running through it's a little video, but playing through a clip of Margaret Atwood reading, and you'll see this is we had all of our audio in SoundCloud. So essentially, SoundCloud was functioning as our Avalon access system, right? It was delivering the audio to our website, and then we were using the SoundCloud player on our website, which is a very nice player, as you probably know, because it allows you to sort of you can click, you can even annotate a little bit or whatever. But we decided for our project, most of the libraries wouldn't tolerate having their archival audio on SoundCloud, right? And plus, SoundCloud every few years might just disappear, right? As we know. So for the last 6 months, one of our web designers worked on building his own player, essentially, for our project. And so what you're seeing here isn't the SoundCloud player anymore; it's a homemade player. But that has the same functionality that SoundCloud had offered us, which is essentially for us to click anywhere on the waveform and bring us to that timestamp moment in the transcription or in the content description. And this is this was identified as a feature that was really much admired and used by a lot of our literature colleagues, like for when they're teaching audio and stuff. Just the fact that it's easy to, navigate a full recording, because most of these recordings are like over an hour long, right? There are different approaches. Like Pen Sound, which is another big online archive of poetry, early on took the approach of chunking all their long recordings into what they call singles. So they actually clipped each of the long recordings into 3-minute poems, right? Which left them in a real problematic position now, because they can't reverse, they can't retrofit their entire project, and they haven't really, they never developed a metadata schema for their stuff. They have a bunch of singles, a bunch of mini files, but they don't have real context for the larger audio from which they were extracted. We decided we're going to try to keep our archival, the digitized version of our artifacts intact, so as whole readings, and then sort of chunk them or break them up in different ways just through GUI methods rather than actually creating individual MP3s or whatever format you're using out of them all. Anyways, this is an example of sort of what we have now as a starting point for what we hope to be able to do going forward. It's also an example of us sort of creating metadata before we even knew we were creating metadata. And you'll see a few other things here. There are some images of the actual artifact. So one thing we did when we were processing the Sir George Williams collection was we took photographs of every tape and all the tape boxes, because there's a lot of metadata actually on those boxes, right? And we included the images as part of our online display. We had a kind of shorter timestamp. We have all the sort of basic metadata, like the duration of the recording, the catalog number, readers, things like that, venue, date. Some of this information wasn't obvious, right? And we had to go into the student newspapers to find it, right, from the 60s and all, like where did this reading take place, etc. And then we have a kind of streamlined, you'll see, timestamp just by line without any transcription on the right. And then we have the longer sort of transcription version of timestamp in the main body. And I guess,
sorry.
Yeah.
Is this a temporary website from the transcriber?
No, it's a website.
Or is it already?
It's built in SpokenWeb, so you can go to.
It's already exploiting the metadata chain, or not yet?
No, this was done before the metadata scheme.
Okay.
And in a way, now we have to reprocess this collection to get that metadata in the proper format for a project for going forward. But it has a lot of GUI components that were already compelling and interesting to our researchers. Now we want to do it in a way, the right way, and not through sort of just plugins and tricks in the back end of WordPress. It's basically a WordPress site. Anyways, here's what it looks like, though, and it is pretty useful. That's an actual silence in the recording, so it's not.
Problem that we have here at St. George. We did try to get a larger hall, but it was impossible. To accommodate the overflow, we have set up.
What's it called? It's called You Are Happy. Somebody who's been photographing me says a friend of hers was in a bookstore, picked up this book and said, I thought at first it was one of these I'm okay, you're okay books, until I saw who wrote it. This is a lost poem called Book of Ancestors. One.
On the website, it's actually legible.
My nickname of a witch. Are you referring to the speech I gave the other night at Loyola?
I know you're ready for a screenplay for Search.
Oh, let's see. I finished it at the end. Yes.
I just wanted to pause here. One of the points of showing this example is that you have audience member. You can't really read it here, but so this says Margaret Atwood. So this is every time she speaks. This is Wynne Francis. She was a professor who did not the introduction, but then was moderating questions afterwards. This says audience member number 4, and there were all different audience members. These are all would fall under, I guess, creator or contributor categories, right? And as metadata, each one would be a different, kind of contributor. So to process this within our metadata schema will sort of require us to take what we had put as information but weren't thinking of as metadata back into the system, right? But this is sort of one version of an interface that we're going to then try to build on and do more interesting things with it. Yeah, I don't think we have to play more of it. But, swallow.
Right. So so we agreed on a scheme, and we immediately began collecting metadata in a like I think everyone else is just about in research across disciplines in a spreadsheet. And you can see a screenshot of that spreadsheet, and it's actually working quite well. Excel is it's a good software to some extent. In that you can color code fields, you can add some controlled vocabulary with drop downs. However, there are limitations to spreadsheets. So the large amount of possible fields means that the cataloger is navigating a very, very wide interface horizontally, and also things like multiple fields, repeating fields like contributor names, various notes. Those we had to, in the spreadsheet, we had to impose as a limit of 3 contributors. And there isn't really an easy way to give the cataloger the option of adding more columns for more contributors. And so we looked, the next was to search for an alternative, to search for essentially a metadata collection tool that would allow for basic create, read, update, delete functionality for metadata. And to some surprise, we couldn't find one, and so it's something that would we didn't find anything that would allow a cataloger to easily browse items by collection and institution, review what they've cataloged, delete, modify existing records, import and export. And since we couldn't find since we couldn't find an existing tool, we decided to develop something custom for this purpose, for the research project. So we wanted this tool to offer an intuitive web interface for catalogers. We also needed to deploy it very quickly. So the timeline is to have a beta version for the next SpokenWeb symposium, which is taking place in May. So it therefore should be lean and rely on existing libraries like Bootstrap and jQuery. And most importantly, it should allow us to manage metadata that is semi-structured, meaning that the metadata scheme is expected to change and evolve over time. The software has to be flexible and allow us to quickly refine and revise the schema and the interface for collecting that data.
I'm just going to jump in quickly just to say one word about timeline, right? So I mentioned we got our funding in the early summer. We basically started working on metadata like in August, after we were stopped celebrating or whatever,
month or two.
Yeah, exactly. But really, we developed our schema, from August into December, and we then created the cataloging document that we showed you in December, and then like a Christmas miracle, Francisco and Tomasz said, we'll be able to build this kind of ingest system, because we were working, the plan is, and that's what we're doing right now, is we're having students beta test our metadata schema basically, and what they find difficult to understand and implementing it using that Excel spreadsheet that we just showed you. But we really want to move into a more solid system so that we can all do our processing and have it stored in a common space, and track sort of questions like a ticketing system almost, if questions come up, and really think about the relationship between our metadata schema and the ingest system, so that development can happen and be responsive.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And so I have to mention our I think you called him our angel, who stepped in, which is Francisco Baris Beitia, a software developer at the library. And I think that the technology stack that we used, PHP, MySQL, and Bootstrap, is largely due to the fact that he has extensive experience with these particular languages and developing similar custom systems in other contexts. And so the basic idea is that we would deploy a database to store the metadata with an API to export and import into JSON and CSV format. We chose to adapt a NoSQL approach. So this is a relatively recent possibility in the sense of the technological support for this. So it allows us to simplify the design of, to really simplify the design of the underlying database. So in the past, with the relational model, we would have to create separate tables for all of the fields, sometimes actually multiple tables for each field. And you can see that summarized for our schema in the diagram on the left. If you can read it, I guess a little bit. So things like content nodes, dates, contributors, everything has to have separate tables. And it becomes very difficult to change if we decide to change the schema. So the NoSQL approach takes advantage of the fact that databases can store and run queries on JSON. And so this allows us to simplify the design into only 3 tables, one for the catalogers, one for the collection information, and the rest of the metadata about each item is going into just one table, which contains structured JSON descriptions for each item. This gives us the flexible backend to the system that will be easy to mold to changing schema requirements. And this is, I have to say, we're still working on this. This is very fresh. And so we drafted some system requirements that consist broadly of kind of a user management where catalogers can log in, kind of reset their passwords, collection management where collection level information is set up. And then the biggest portion is this item management where each individual item is described and cataloged. And in addition to that, some import and export functionality. So this slide has some wireframes where we designed the interface to fit onto a regular screen without having to scroll around too much, and allowing the cataloger to modify metadata fields by group by section. For example, physical description fields with built-in control vocabularies for each field. And this here you see a screenshot of the source code actually for this as it's happening. So there are, and everything is using, we try to use as much as possible JSON, which is really a lot like XML, except it's simpler. So there are JSON files for the various controlled vocabulary lists, and the actual scheme itself, which is what you see here. Oh, and actually you can't read that. It looks like some sort of alien language. Is encoded as a version JSON file that is then used to generate the entire interface. And so the idea is that modifying the schema, for example, adding or removing a field, it would be just as easy as just going into this one file and changing it right there, a few lines, and the whole interface would change to accommodate that new schema. And so the development began recently, like I said, but the user and collection management was developed first. So you can see here it's a screenshot of me kind of logging in to the system. I should say it was named after the bird.
Songbird.
The songbird.
We were thinking of a poetry songbird that also was appropriate for an ingest system, so swallow seemed to work well. Yeah. And also, just by chance, the first 2 letters are SW, like for SpokenWeb, so just seemed right.
Yes. Also, there's a Czech movie that I really like called "And Give My Love to the Swallows." I don't know if you've seen it; it's really beautiful, but sad. That's because it's about the war. Sad, but anyway, so the catalogers log in and modify the passwords if needed, and so on. And the collection management screenshot kind of looks like this. Basically editing short descriptions of collections and then associating items with them. I mean, the bulk of the development will be in saving, editing, and retrieving the item metadata that's stored as a JSON. Here you can see on the slide a kind of an in-development deposit interface, the material description section of this. We had an interesting discussion about whether or not a picture of the artifact belongs in the system, as this is not textual metadata, but an image, and it requires actually uploading a digital file. I think in the end, we will try to deliver this option to upload images.
Yeah, we did in our processing document, we do include a process for photographing the assets, how to prepare the digital images so they can be included in metadata. And now it seems like our ingest system will accommodate.
And so yeah, to summarize, this was Swallow. So there's a web backend, JSON storage, and an export API that make this metadata available to other systems. So we don't know yet which access system we'll end up using and how, but it is certain that mapping scripts will be required to get this metadata into other systems like Avalon or Islandora. I should also say that one of the really nice things about having having the schema like this is that actually we decided to make it possible to hold multiple versions of the schema in the system. And so if you save a record in an older version of the schema, the interface will sort of open up so you retain access to all of those old records. It'll tell you that you're looking at a previous schema version, and even if optionally attempt to migrate it for you to the new version. But I guess yeah, this is like it was mentioned before. We're going to need these crosswalks to get this data out into access systems, so this actually is an example of a crosswalk, I'm not sure if it's a completed crosswalk, but at least a comparison, a mapping document for our schema in Avalon, pointing out which fields map to Avalon fields and which simply aren't there in the system, and so would require some molding or some transformation. So to taking this approach allows us to have a rich and diverse metadata collection phase to the project. And we won't be limited by existing access systems, which tend to be large and not necessarily specific to this particular research domain. And we leave the mapping into these systems to a later phase. So, and perhaps there will be no way of migrating some of the fields that we decided to store, but I don't think we should be limited by that. In the data collection stage, and I'm really hoping that actually one of the benefits of this project will be that in other areas too, in other research projects, the data collection phase should allow for flexibility like this. And I think that's what I have. I think we wanted to have a discussion. Luckily, I've been eyeing that clock.
Yeah, we went longer than we thought.
That's great. Well, thank you very much. That'll be, potentially a great video for the SpokenWeb website. If you want to have an overview, now people can refer to that. It was a good detailed thing. And I guess I'll take the privilege of the first question from our audience. Marcelo is not here. Usually Marcelo does the first question, and it's not actually a question from Marcelo. It's a question from Servan Monjour, who's been watching it at home while you were discussing. And so the question that she had was to try to think, and maybe it's more for Jason, about thinking about Zoom Tour's comment in the 60s about how the future of literature will be, orally based, and the idea of what do you see studying a corpus like that moves away from the more kind of hegemony of print culture as a kind of a key issue? Do you see that sort of project being in some ways a case study of what happens when we start looking at a large-scale series of collections of data recording? Or would some of the poetry themselves, the poems themselves included in these, will be looked at in a different way when you actually hear the original in these kind of rare recordings of 60s poets reading their work, when it's maybe taught or read differently these days?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think it allows for a variety of different results, right? So one thing so definitely it allows us to think about the printed poem differently, right? You can hear the poem read, especially across different collections, maybe 5 or 6 different times, the same poem, right? And you can think about how it's not the same poem, depending on where it was read. And so it does change our approach or even our interpretation or understanding of the significance of the printed poem. But I think mostly we're more interested in questions not just comparative to the printed poem, right? But sort of more along the lines of where the question started, right? And I think it's not a single case study, but I think what we're finding is that the significance of orality in literary performance dissemination really changes over time, right? And the meaning of literary performance changes. And one of the values of having different collections is that we'll have a whole series of different case studies. So if we think about what I would call a fairly typical format for the 1960s poetry reading, right? They tended to be a lot longer than poetry readings are now. They would last sometimes an hour and a half to 2 hours. They might have an intermission. This is just a single poet reading, right? So they would arrive and they would say, like, tonight I'm going to read, and they'd read like 2 books. They wouldn't just read a couple of poems, right? But even more than that, their performance was often, and we've begun to sort of do some measurements based on the audio, more than 60% speech and not actually reading, right? So a literary performance in the 60s was a kind of existential oral performance, right? It was a performance of what the process of being a writer, being an artist meant, right? And so there, you're looking at literary performance, but you're not only talking about the printed work being performed, you're talking about the writer who's reading some of his or her printed works, talking about the process by which those works were written, right? And that's as much a part of the literary performance in the 1960s, say, poetry reading, than the reading is itself, right? So maybe that's one way of answering it. And that would be one case study about what the importance of really talking, right? So that a reading was maybe 40% reading and 60% like lecture, or autobiographical performance of some kind, when we look at, we have archives from different periods. The 70s, one of the 70s archives that we're looking at, it seemed much more about intermedia approaches to performance. So they were integrating audio media into performance, sort of like Jackson McClough was doing already in the 60s, but also beginning to use film and early video and dance and so basically more sort of multi-media and art performances, right, that are being recorded. And so again, it's even beyond orality. It's sort of a multi-sensorial mode of literary performance. The 80s, we just started working on a new collection that was of the Ultimatum Festival. Has anyone heard of that festival? So it's an amazing collection because it's half Francophone poets, half Anglophone poets, and some American poets. And it's, I think, the first punk poetry series that happened in Montreal. It took place at Foufoune Electrique. And it was like a mixture of so they brought in like Kathy Acker and John Giorno and sort of, the 80s sort of legacy of the beat poets, right? But then you had like older Quebecois poets like Denis Vanier, but then you had like more recent Quebecois poets. And then you had a whole range of spoken word performers. And most of those performances had music. So they were like basically punk bands or new wave bands, like just playing all the time in the background during the performances, right? So it's a whole other kind of oral experience that you wouldn't get on the text, get on the page at all. And increasingly from the 80s on, 2 of our collections are very much sort of spoken word oriented collections. So sometimes there is no page source even to begin with, right? They really are, they're oral pieces that were designed only for oral performance. So, but I think every collection in a way poses different questions about the significance of orality in relation to performance and the printed word, if there even is one.
I would have a question. I was surprised in the work on the metadata you've done, you didn't use English, it's FRBR, functional requirements for bibliographical code or RDA from. the Library of Congress, because as you are dealing with performance acts, or some of them are related to works, you need to make this relationship more explicit, maybe.
Yes, or no. I mean, it's a really great question. How, if I could push the question back to you, how do you think that our instructions to graduate students who are cataloging these items should change in order to?
I think it's quite easy. It's in your model. You have to structure a work item, relate work item to record. That means that you should express the relationship more directly. That's a kind of, it depends on the metadata model. It's not much more difficult to express from the cataloger point of view. It's just to make it explicit.
Yeah, I mean, I think our objective with the metadata task force, and I guess there's multiple things going on here. So these recordings are really archival objects. And so the primary sort of point of interest, it's my understanding, the primary kind of what we are actually cataloging is, you know, a video cassette or an audio cassette or a reel-to-reel tape. And so that's kind of the object that is of interest. And the idea of the relationship between a work and a manifestation, this is really implied in a lot of the standards that do exist. And so I guess one interesting exercise would be to see, well, given how our schema exists, that's the question that I asked you, you know, how would we have to change the actual cataloging instructions in order to, and would we have to change them? Because the Ferber model is it's a model, and like all models, the model is not the territory, and so whether or not, like how our instructions would have to change or our schema would have to change it's an exercise we haven't done to see, like, to do an analysis of what is it that we would have to alter in the schema. But I don't think we would end up having to change very much at all for it to be compatible with this model. Which is why I threw it your way to say, did you see something in particular in the schema?
Bah oui, forcément, parce qu'à partir du moment où tu as une œuvre distincte de son interprétation, il faut que le modèle embarque cette distinction. Et donc, si on a un modèle à plat qui traite seulement un ou l'autre, pas l'œuvre séparément. Et c'est pas très compliqué à faire BR finalement. Ce que ça dit simplement, c'est qu'il y a des œuvres, des manifestations et des expressions et des items. C'est tout à fait approprié pour documenter précisément ce type d'objet. C'est pour ça que je suis surpris que vous ne l'ayez pas retenu, notamment parce qu'il a été, bien sûr c'est un modèle conceptuel, mais il a été traduit dans plusieurs modèles de métadonnées. Aux États-Unis, dans l'espace nord-américain, c'est RDA qui l'implémente. En France, il y a aussi BigFrame, d'autres solutions. Et comme vous êtes libre de votre schéma de métadonnées, puisque vous développez votre logiciel de gestion de métadonnées, finalement, vous pouvez l'implémenter. Et donc, je vous pose la question parce que il me semble que, du point de vue de la recherche, savoir qu'on a deux interprétations du même poème dans deux performances différentes, par deux personnes différentes, c'est pertinent.
Est-ce que l'œuvre, en ce cas, c'est le poème que vous parlez?
L'œuvre, c'est l'idée de l'œuvre, et puis cette idée de l'œuvre se manifeste dans différentes réalisations, et précisément pour traiter de ces choses-là, j'ai l'impression que ça exprime bien ce dont on parle.
Parce qu'il y a plusieurs œuvres dans chaque enregistrement.
Bien sûr, mais ça, c'est pas un problème.
Alors, et on a déjà parlé de cette question au début. C'était quand on a parlé de la question de titre. Oui, parce qu'au début, Jared a pensé, titre quand on parle de titre, on parle de titre de l'œuvre, de chaque œuvre. Alors, s'il y a un enregistrement de une vingtaine de poèmes, oui, est-ce qu'on met tous les titres? Alors, it became a question of what's the title, right, for this event, right? Because most of these are recordings of events. They're not commercial recordings, right? So they were made by people there. And so the œuvre in this case is the reading as a whole, right? And then there are titles of poems read that refer to books usually, right? That are identified in the contents field, which is the field that that's where I think this question would be most relevant, right? Because if you're listing the contents of a recording, right? If you're listing maybe the titles of 20 poems that are read within the larger recording, and you want to be able to identify that poem comes from this book, which is what I think of as the in another context, right? So it's like, I'm not thinking in the technical way. It could be, yeah. So like when we did the original descriptions for that first collection, we'd have a general description that said, so-and-so reads from these 3 books, right? Because that's where the poems come from. These are poetry readings. So if you're talking about fiction readings, then the novel would be noted. And then in the timestamping, we had the actual titles that were sourced from those original works, right? So we got the title right, because sometimes they might say the title, but is that the actual full title of the poem? We would want to have the full title of the poem, right? So we went and we had in the contents, what would become our contents note, the description of what the sources were for our getting the actual titles of the works. But this is just to say, it's not an answer to your question really, but to say that as we sort of started talking about title as a category, it opened up this huge question about what is the œuvre, right? How do we handle titles of individual things that are noted within, right? And and I think that's to sort of this sort of hierarchy that you're referring to. That might be I don't know, but it might be a solution or a way to.
Yeah, no, I think it's a really great question, and I appreciate it. Like we said, we're very early on in the process, and it's certainly not too late for us to kind of build further, mechanisms into the model. I mean, I guess kind of commenting on things that Jason and Tomasz have said. I feel like Ferber works best when there's like a really authoritative work, whether it's like it's like a manuscript of a particular musical score, and then there's different performers who have kind of variations, and you want to track those things, or a published a collection of poems, and then these it kind of depends what you foreground and what you consider authoritative. I think my understanding is a lot of the content in these collections, it's not necessarily that simple of matching the recordings to authoritative printed versions, and it can go the other way around, or it can be very ambiguous with what is the kind of the authoritative version. So it can be a bit tricky, I think, in the Ferber model. But I think it's a really good point, and like Jason and Tomasz said, it is something that we thought about early on, and it starts to kind of make your head get a little hot, and then maybe put it aside for a bit. But I appreciate the reminder about it, for sure.
I mean, like, the most important goal for the task force was to create cataloging instructions that are easy to follow for the catalogers. And we're certainly still talking about the title. And but if we try to explain Ferber as a part of those instructions, I'm not sure if it would really help things. And so in the example that Jason gave earlier of Roy Kiyuka recording conversations in a hotel room, to try and then you have this recording, and you need to, as a cataloger, you need to assign it a title.
Oui, ça c'est un problème de bibliothécaire. Fondamentalement, le titre, en l'occurrence, c'est devenu une obligation parce que c'est une norme bibliothéconomique. En pratique, ces objets n'ont pas forcément de titre. Et ce titre, il peut être forgé. Il y a des règles pour forger les titres. Il faut baptiser la du titre. La question, c'est de savoir ce qu'on décrit et quelle raison. Mais Je comprends bien la préoccupation, parce qu'après, pour l'interopérabilité, il nous faut un titre.
Oui, c'est ça.
Oui. Nicolas, tu avais un point, on a juste quelques minutes.
Yes, well, I really like the whole presentation and the project, in particular the insight you have already on what you anticipate on the archive, how to make it a cultural archive and not only a librarian archive, but really to, like with the podcasting, for example. And of course, it echoes to the project we have here with the Greek anthology. Now we'll speak a bit more about it. And her project is AP Pop because it's really about making the Greek anthology circulating into our present culture. So that's I really appreciate this approach that you have. I was wondering about the metadata process. You have now a 10-page process, 10-page instruction. Is it? Are you going to segment the work? Like one student will take one page, like a few fields, and going through several records or items, or is it one student taking the whole fields for one record, and then that could be a 2 months research, maybe, I don't know. How do you segment this work, and how do you organize the task force?
And maybe I'll double back immediately on that question. Is how do you do quality control? You have like 3 students entering field, and you look at fields that are like odd because only 2 out of 3 got them, or
I can tell you what we're doing right now. We have students, 1 to 2 students at each of 5 different universities working on different collections, testing out the schema. It's actually longer than 10 pages. The schema is maybe more like 30 pages. The instruction manual. And they're doing all fields. So when we worked on the schema itself, we broke down the categories into smaller teams so that groups of 2 developed one field, right? So, but for the actual processing, we're trying right now for students to do the whole thing. Some of them are very repeatable. So, if it's the same for a whole collection, it's easy just to fill that in, Some of them require actual research. Some of them they haven't been able to do yet. Depends if the collection's been digitized or not, right? If they can even listen to it, they can only do the physical description. They can't actually, hear what's on it and start, But it seems to be working quite well for an individual to do all of the fields. The quality control question is a very important one, especially because we're really still changing the schema as we go right now. We're still developing it, right? And so what we've integrated, we've thought about this. We have this large task force, metadata task force, and we asked for people to volunteer to be controllers, right? Like sort of almost like an IT ticketing system, And so Tomasz was one of the volunteers, and Roma Kao from University of Toronto was another. And so they're the 2 metadata controllers. And they had a meeting to talk about how this would work. So maybe you want to say a little bit more about it, and it's still like we're working on it right now.
Yeah, so there's multiple things happening in that. We're also collecting feedback from the catalogers about where they're having difficulties, what they're finding, where their questions are. And with the eye to maybe, modify the schema and also to answer questions. And so we decided, and we're still early on, we decided to field by field in terms of our answers to questions. So let's say questions come in, I don't know how to assign the title. I'm confused. Should I, when it says like my tape on the tape, should I use that because the instructions say you should favor what is written on the artifact? Is that good enough? Or should I construct a descriptive title with the name of the speaker and the venue name and so on? And I don't know. That's actually one of the questions. Like how do I know which option to use for the title? And so the way in which we will answer that question, and then we'll make the answer available to all of the catalogers, so we have a record of what we're answering.
Yeah, we're using a teamwork software, like basically if you're familiar with it. And so every task force has its own project area, right? And so this document, so all the catalogers will have access to the answers that would go out to all the other catalogers as well. And as we sort of test this out, ideally, sort of either Tomasz or Roma will be able to check in, regularly and answer the questions that the catalogers have using teamwork. So we're still sort of testing that out. Yeah, so that's.
And I wonder, which are the relationships that you have with the actual scene of Montreal, of spoken word, slam poetry, and so on? Like, do you know the existence of the Open Mic documentary? There was a documentary that was, I don't know if it was actually fundraised, but it was on a fundraising platform to make a documentary of the Open Mic scene of Montreal, made by 2 students of like UQAM, probably, maybe something. Mm-hmm. It's Open Mic, and all the scene of the festival d'Antatet. There's that is in this March.
Yeah,
because I'm teaching paraliterature, and there's a session on the spoken word and so on. And problem is, I don't have any material to show to students, except for the festival La Nuit de la Poésie.
Yeah, that's the
except for that.
Yeah, that film. Yeah.
Which are your relations with the actual scene, the contemporary scene of Montreal?
It's a great question. So I'm familiar with some. There are a lot of scenes, right? Not familiar with everything that's happening. I know CRIHN really well. She was my student actually at Concordia, and I've participated in Festival d'Antatet before, and so I'm familiar with that. But I don't even know if they're documenting their events, right?
I don't think so.
They're not, right? So we're that's the thing. There are all kinds of events. Not all of them are recorded, right? It's not like it's a comprehensive archive. We're mostly focusing on historical archives. So in a way, we could call them closed archives for the most part. They've happened, from the 60s until the 90s, but it doesn't mean we won't also begin, thinking. But we are very interested in sort of bringing these materials into contemporary literary scenes. So the community partners are the starting point for that, right? So we have 3 community partners that we've started with. One is Ian Ferrier. He's been running a show called Words and Music, right? It's been for 20 years. It's mostly at Casa del Popolo. It's very diverse series. So we have an agreement that in addition to working, we're actually processing he's recorded every event that they ever did. So that's an amazing 20 years worth of every month, of an event. But also he's given us his stage twice a year to do different events and to participate with some of the contemporary poets who are performing, putting things together. So we did one around Christmas. We did our first sort of SpokenWeb event where we had some poets who are affiliated with our project work with. We did a sound and dance mix of archival audio and performed it at in the Words and Music show. And we're partners with Blue Metropolis Festival as well. So we're going to do 3 events at Blue Metropolis this year, just to try to this is the first year, so to get some of the word out about this project that will allow us to collaborate with contemporary scenes that exist. There's a new series called Cabaret Bâtard. I don't know if you've seen that one. It was held at La Ruciola, and it's interesting because it's a bilingual series. I'm kind of interested in having because it started with English language archives primarily. I've been interested in not to be comprehensive, but to add some French language collections to our whole project, right? So the Ultimatum Festival collection is a really interesting one because it is bilingual one. So I think, and then we're also collaborators with Archive Montreal. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Archive Montreal. It's Louis Rastelli, but I don't know if you know Expozine. So he organizes Expozine. He's really a community archive. He's very linked to a lot of basically literary scene, counterculture scenes in Montreal, both French and English. And he organizes a lot of events as well. So we're starting with a few partners who were signed on to the partnership to begin with. And we have, as I showed you, a task force that's called Community Outreach and Engagement. And it's both about finding collections, but it's also about working on curating events of different kinds with local communities. So we'll be working on ones in Montreal, but every partner in a different city, in Vancouver and Edmonton and Calgary, are also sort of doing that kind of engagement. So we hope to bring this stuff. I mean, it's really interesting we did an event last night, it was at Concordia, but it was a mixture of archival audio and contemporary poets reading, right? And it's really interesting to have an audience. There were about 30 people there. It was really a successful event, I thought. And there were a lot of poets in the audience too. And it's really interesting to go to a performance and you hear live readers reading new poems that they've just, written, and then have, clips from readings that took place 40 years ago, and it kind of creates this sense of historical location about what it means to, and very self-conscious awareness of what it means to be performing work, in the present, so the archive can really make you reflect on what you're doing, as a performer, so we'd like to sort of bring some of that up.
We should, wrap up our session today, but thanks again for a really great presentation on the fascinating project.
Thank you. Thank you.